right, Mike. So over the years, we've got to do some technical work together. We've been able to work uh, at airports together. We've been able to work on dams. Some stuff that I think there's a technical nature to. And generally speaking, every market I've been in, when you're working on a dam or you're working at an airport, there's just more regulation from the owner. There's usually a quality control, probably a quality assurance, and then usually even regulators have some level of inspection that might be above and beyond all of that. I think we've kind of learned some things over the years, and this might be, just in my opinion, a good opportunity to share those so that somebody else who's going into one of those types of projects can say, oh, that's a good point, I can avoid this issue.
Yeah.
So maybe talk a little bit about some of the quality control, quality assurance alignment we've done.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I've seen in my career is that owners who see the benefits of alternative delivery, specifically the CMAR process.
Yeah, which for those who aren't in our market, because construction manager at risk, or in other markets it'll be CMGC, construction manager GC approach, maybe even called more of a design build approach.
Yeah.
It's a little different than a design build, but where you have an opportunity to collaborate through the pre-construction process.
Exactly. And when we do work with certain agencies, the amount of scrutiny that is placed on the test data that we produce during the project, it's so significant that, and it leads to so many potential issues after the project's done that can't be resolved because the project's built and here we are trying to sift through this data. Certain owners have really looked at these alternative delivery methods as a way to kind of root those things out and get them solved ahead of time. Yeah. And we do that by, on some of these, I have input on the plans and specifications for the project. Sometimes testing issues are a function of what it says in the construction documents just isn't good language that could have been avoided simply by having an expert like myself be a part of the pre-construction. We've got a project right now, it's at 60% design, so I'm being asked to review those documents, specifically with a focus on the testing aspects of it, so that when it does go to construction, you've hopefully headed off at the pass some of those things. So let's talk about what some of those things can be. Well, a lot of times a earthwork contractor has to be able to achieve a certain level of minimum compaction on a project. And it sounds pretty simple, but in order to document that compaction's been achieved, often two different companies have to be able to get the data with their own personnel and equipment doing those tests. And keep in mind that on some of these, we're trying to achieve a fairly high level of compaction. Yeah. So if you don't have all the potential issues ironed out before you get started down that road, you may not be able to reach that level of compaction by both entities. So what are some of those things? Well, in our market in Arizona, we often use one of two test procedures at a job site to evaluate and document what level of compaction the contractor has achieved. So one of them is called a nuclear density test, and then the other one's called a sand cone density test. And we're going to demonstrate these tests later, but basically they're just ways that we can go to a job site and put a piece of equipment or multiple pieces of equipment on the ground and come up with a value as to what the in-place density is and the moisture content. But there's a lot of components to those tests that everybody needs to understand in order to get a good correlation between multiple entities testing on a project. What could those be? Well, for starters, the equipment that we use. Well, here in our market, we pretty much have to have an accreditation through the AASHTO Materials Reference Laboratory, or AMRL. So that's a federal agency that comes to our facilities and observes us doing these tests so that we're doing them by the standard.
Yeah.
Pretty much every test that we run on your job site, we're supposed to be doing it by some recognized standard. It might be a federal standard, say ASTM, or a local standard with the City of Phoenix or ADOT, you name it. But one of the things is all the entities doing the testing need to be running the same procedure. But when these agencies come out, they do a pretty thorough examination of our quality systems manual, our people, the equipment, and as part of that, we have to calibrate our equipment. So some equipment's calibrated every 6 months, some of it's on an annual basis. But as a contractor, it's important that you know that sometimes a bad test or an inconsistent test result is just a function of not having the right equipment or equipment that's not calibrated out there. So, and that's one area where a testing company can cut the corners if they need to, trying to get away without doing those calibrations, because a lot of these we have to send out to an outside agency or business to do those calibrations. So there's a cost with that.
I was just gonna say, I even think that not all people are doing that maliciously. I mean, construction and testing can be busy, and hey, the nuke gauge was supposed to be recalibrated a month ago, but it's summertime, we're working a lot of hours, we can't really afford to lose another nuke gauge. So it's probably good, it's only a month overdue.
Yeah.
So I don't, it may not always be malicious intent, but definitely easy to see how your nuke gauge could go past its calibration period. And
definitely,
in some cases, like you said, there are probably those who aren't accredited because they don't want to spend the money to be accredited. And when it comes to certifications, it's an extra expense that if they could avoid, they might.
Yeah, and as part of this accreditation process, for us to maintain our accreditation, we have to spend money just on these inspections that they come and do. But another part of it is called the PSP, which stands for Proficiency Sample Program. Well, what's that? Well, that's literally where back in Washington, D.C., they gather samples and send them to all the labs across the country that do, let's say, a sieve analysis test, for instance. So there might be a couple hundred labs all over the country doing this sieve analysis test. We all submit our results back to the government, and they tell us how we're doing, basically. And again, there's no revenue for us in this. We're kind of doing this for practice to make sure we're doing a good job. And then if for some reason we have test data that doesn't marry up to everybody else's, because that's what they're doing, they're comparing us to every other testing company, we have to write a response and investigate why didn't we get the same numbers as these other folks. So when we go through this process with AMRL to be accredited to do these, and we go through the proficiency sample program, sometimes our results just don't correlate well to what all these other companies have done. So we have to investigate what might have gone wrong there. And that's something that a contractor could do, is if you're having an issue on a particular test, it's completely okay. I would welcome anybody to ask for our proficiency sample testing results on a given, I want to do a good job as well as anybody. I welcome anybody to challenge us and show us where we might be doing something wrong.
I hear you saying that and I agree, but I also think it's important that contractors don't hear this and say, well, every time a test results isn't what I want, I'm going to challenge. I think, it's okay to challenge. It needs to be done in the right way. Hey Mike, something's off here. We feel like we know these soil types. We've never had compaction in these issues in these soil types. Is it possible that we have maybe a procedure issue or a calibration issue? Can we look into that? Also, I think what happens so often is contractors, we get so focused on costs that what's the saying, like we step over the quarter to pick up the penny or whatever, right? Step over the dollar to pick up the dime, where we're so worried about, well, hey, I could just have your guy come out and I could pay him for a day. And we could run through doing, hey, let's do a 1-point proctor and make sure it matches the proctor curves that we're using on this side. Let's get a second newt gauge out here and let's do another test with another newt gauge. We could troubleshoot it together, and even if it cost us half the day, the savings of not wasting our time and putting material in that's not making compaction, it's worth it.
Yeah.
But it's so hard sometimes for us to think like, I'm gonna go spend $1,000 I don't feel like I should have to.
Right.
Because we can't figure out the issue. But so often, my experience is align with your partner. Don't come at you like a bully, but let's just talk about, hey, we think there's a potential issue. What are your ideas? What can we do?
Yeah.
Oftentimes you might say the same things that I just said, like, well, let's get another newt gauge out there. Let's try it.
Yeah.
Let's run a sand cone, correlate the data with the newt gauge.
Oh, yeah. And kind of to further your point, with one particular owner that we do a lot of work with, we participate in what I call a correlation exercise. Before there's any live bullets going on in the project where there's fill being placed, we'll actually go out there, almost a month before there's going to be any earthwork. The quality control laboratory as well as the quality acceptance laboratory. And one thing that we'll do is we'll have both companies bring 2 or 3 different nuclear density gauges, because you can have subtle differences from one gauge to the next, from one gauge, even though it's the same model between companies. And the idea there is to basically do our own approval before the project starts that, yep, boy, that company, they've got 2 gauges that they correlate really well with the other company's gauges. So we want to make sure those are the ones that are used during the project.
Yeah.
But we go even further. We'll do test with those on like a sample area of fill that's been prepared for the sole purpose of making sure QA and QC can get correlated before the job starts. Because once it gets going, if we're shut down for a week while QA and QC figure out why one company can't get the results the other one did, then it gets to be pretty contentious.
Yeah.
And almost too late.
Yeah. And it's interesting, if I remember right, even sometimes we try and make sure we have the same technicians.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, we're going to have 2 or 3 technicians from each company be here as well, so we know not only does the test equipment calibrate, but the people doing the tests calibrate, because there is human error at times.
Yep.
And getting people who know the process, who are repeating results, that kind of all speaks to, like, we can avoid issues by spending a little bit of time and money up front. On this particular project, we luck out because the owner sees intrinsic value as well.
Yes.
And so they're willing to help pay for some of this.
Yes.
But when the owner's not, I still think as contractors, it's worth considering, hey, if QA and QC don't have the same results, what's that going to cost me?
Yeah.
What's it going to cost me to spend a day or two to align?
Mm-hmm.
If you're placing millions of yards of dirt on an earthen embankment, probably worth it.
Absolutely.
Almost certainly worth it. Because,
Absolutely.
My experience, QC frequency is usually higher and QA is usually lower. So you spend the time and money to get them aligned. If QA has a bad result, how far back do you have to go? Do you have to go back to the last QA result, which may be thousands of yards of dirt? Because you usually can't rely on QC at that point. It's kind of like, well, QC said everything was passing, and now QA has a bad result, so we have to go back to where QA and QC both had good results.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a few thousand yards of dirt has to come out, be put back in. That's not a cheap deal, especially if you're placing filter embankment near it. It's in a dam situation that can be very problematic.
Yeah, and I'm kind of involved in a project like that now, where even though we did everything, it was a CMAR project, We tried to have, we did a pre-construction meeting just about QA, QC testing. We talked about all the procedures we were going to do. We still had some problems with the other entity doing testing, mainly because we just couldn't get the data from them. Our role was to review that too. We couldn't get it. By the time we got it, we were finding issues with it. And at the end of the day, we're stuck now with a project where all of our tests passed. The other entity, they thought they passed while the work was going on, but upon further review and them dissecting the data and others asking questions of their data, I believe 20% of their field density tests are now failing tests.
Yeah, that's not good.
And that's a big number. It's not unusual to have maybe 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 tests be a failure and you rework it and you get it to pass. But we're working through that process now where we're trying to explain what happened and come up with reasons why there's differences in these numbers. Because we were both out there testing the same stuff at the same time, but all of ours passed and the other entities having 20% failure rate. And that feeds into the thing that I see too, that a contractor needs to know, like, how open-minded is the agency and or the owner to the process to work through to get testing issues resolved. Because some agencies really want that to be an open, collaborative process where almost like an independent audit is done of both entities doing the testing to try to find some subtle difference that they're doing. And then other owners or agencies take the approach, no, we don't want you guys talking to each other. Just you, Mr. Contractor, you just figure out how to make it pass. And that can lead to, again, these slowdowns, production rates decreasing, and it can be expensive. So just knowing what the entity is where you as a general contractor are going to be working, what kind of the established rules of engagement are, I find useful.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think to sum up kind of this discussion, just talking a little bit about best practices, in particular in the QC scenario. So one is, even if the owner isn't willing to, there should be a real discussion about how do we get QA and QC to go do these tests in a real scenario and find alignment. Having multiple gauges, multiple pieces of equipment, and then noting those down as kind of the approved for this project, because things change. So I remember there was a project we were on, and they introduced a new nuke gauge, like 8 months into it or something. And when they did, it was clear that there were slight nuances, like this, slight changes. So, it comes down to this kind of, hey, let's align, let's agree on procedures, personnel, equipment, and memorialize that. So if something changes, you can do something about it. So I think that's one. And it's great when you have an owner who's willing to help pay for that. But like we said earlier, I think it's worth the investment. I think two is, before you start deciding on labs, have a discussion about their accreditation. Sorry, say that word.
Accreditation.
Accreditation. I can't
you got
say
it. It just doesn't feel right.
It doesn't feel right. And are they, because maybe you have no one in your market that is, but likely you do.
Yeah.
Likely there's somebody that is, and that should give you a little bit more assurance that, hey, they're doing this right. I think also, we talked about partnering. I think this is where partnering comes into effect, though, because not only do you want an owner who's open-minded and is willing to have these discussions of, hey, we have difference in QA, QC tests, but you also need to be partnered with the geotechnical firm that realizes it's possible that someone on their team could have made a mistake. And it's not the end of the world. Like, that's the learning process.
Oh, yeah.
The learning process usually is littered with mistakes. That's how you do it.
Yeah.
So I think two is, not only having the accreditation, but make sure you're aligning with a partner who is open-minded and who's willing to find ways to do things better, who's willing to admit mistakes and get better each day. I think if you can do those three things, that a lot of the other best practice items that we'll talk about the specific tests, and that kind of starts to falls in line naturally because you're working with a partner who really is doing the job right, has that mentality of how do we get better, how do we do this the right way.
Oh yeah. And again, not every project is you're gonna have this issue with a QA and a QC.
Yep.
But if you're doing public works, you're doing infrastructure projects, there's a good chance that you as a contractor need to hire somebody to do your testing for you, but there's going to be somebody else doing
Some testing.
And you may be hiring a company to do QC for you, but they might be doing QA for you against you on another project.
Yeah.
Even in a market like Phoenix where there's 20 of us, there's only so many to go around on these various projects. So one thing I would want my estimators to know if I'm a general contractor are we going to have the potential of dueling laboratories on the project, right? Because I can kind of check that box like, oh man, if there's going to be quality assurance testing, I wonder who that's going to be, right? Because for starters, no sense in getting a price for quality control from that entity that's already doing quality assurance on the project. You may have a relationship with them and be able to find a little bit about the project because they've already been involved in it for a few months as well.
Yeah.
So certainly that feeds back into the networking discussion and just having people you can reach out to find those things out.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think this conversation was valuable. I hope you find it valuable. Some of the best practices and how to align between quality control, quality assurance. Take some of these steps and you'll avoid some of the issues that we've unfortunately had to have ourselves and pay for. But we thank you for your time and hope you enjoy it.